Cat won't stop crying after owner's death. Then the vet reads its collar and is stunned. The autumn wind whistled through the bare branches outside Riverside Animal Shelter, carrying with it the sharp scent of approaching winter and the last remnants of fallen leaves. Inside, Dr. Scott Smith stood at his desk, reviewing the day's intake forms with the methodical precision that had earned him a reputation as one of Boston's most dedicated veterinarians. 20 years of practice had taught him to expect the unexpected, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him that November morning. The cat arrived in a weathered carrier, its once bright blue plastic now faded to a dull gray. Through the metal gate, a pair of amber eyes gazed out warily, filled with a depth of emotion that made Scott's breath catch in his throat. According to the intake form, the cat's name was Tom, a plain name for what was clearly no ordinary feline. "He hasn't eaten for days," explained Sarah Martinez, the social worker who brought him in. Her voice carried the weight of too many similar stories. "His owner, Mrs. Thompson, passed away last week. No family to take him, and he's been inconsolable ever since. Won't stop crying, barely sleeps. The neighbors said they could hear him all night, calling for her." Scott knelt before the carrier, speaking in the soft, measured tones he reserved for his most traumatized patients. "Hello there, Tom. I know you've been through a lot, but you're safe here." The cat blinked slowly, a single tear tracking down his face, something Scott had seen only a handful of times in his career. Cats could cry emotional tears, though it was rare, and it never failed to move him deeply. As Sarah prepared to leave, she hesitated. "There's something else, Dr. Smith. Mrs. Thompson, she mentioned something strange in her final days. Said Tom had a secret, something about his collar. But she was on heavy medication, and we assumed." She shrugged apologetically. "Well, you know how it can be at the end." Scott nodded, watching as Sarah left, her heels clicking against the linoleum floor. Turning back to the carrier, he noticed something peculiar. The cat's collar, barely visible through the grate, bore a tag that gleamed too brightly to be as old as the worn leather supporting it. But every time Scott tried to get a closer look, Tom would shrink away, one paw protectively covering the metal disc. Over the next few days, Scott found himself increasingly intrigued by the mysterious feline. Tom exhibited behaviors that spoke of exceptional intelligence and training. He used the litter box perfectly, waited patiently during examinations, and showed an almost human-like understanding of conversation. But he remained deeply depressed, eating only when hand-fed, and spending hours staring out the window, his sorrowful cries echoing through the shelter at night. The breakthrough came on the fourth day. Scott had taken to spending his lunch breaks with Tom, reading aloud from medical journals or simply talking about his day. "You remind me of my first cat, you know," he said, unwrapping his sandwich. "Same wise eyes. She lived to be 21, if you can believe it. Stubbornest creature I ever met, except maybe you." For the first time, Tom moved closer voluntarily, pressing his head against Scott's hand. The gesture was so unexpected, so full of trust, that Scott remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Slowly, carefully, he reached for the collar tag that had thus far remained a mystery. This time, Tom didn't pull away. The tag was newer than the collar, probably only a few years old. As Scott turned it over, his heart nearly stopped. On one side was indeed the name Tom, but on the other, in smaller text, was engraved, "If found, please contact Susan White, 617-555-0123. He is deeply missed." "Oh my God," Scott whispered, the pieces suddenly falling into place. With trembling fingers, he reached for his computer, pulling up the shelter's database. It took only minutes to find what he was looking for, a missing cat report from 6 years ago, filed by Susan White of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The photo showed a younger Tom, his amber eyes unmistakable, wearing the same leather collar. The story, as Scott would soon discover, was both heartbreaking and extraordinary. Susan White had adopted Tom as a kitten from a local rescue in 2015. For 3 years, they were inseparable. Susan, a widow who worked from home as a freelance editor, often joked that Tom was her best editor, sitting on her desk and tapping the screen when he spotted a typo. They developed the kind of deep bond that comes from sharing every moment, every meal, every joy and sorrow. Then, in 2018, during a routine vet visit, Tom had escaped from his carrier in the parking lot. Susan spent months searching for him, posting flyers, checking shelters, and offering a reward. She never gave up hope, renewing his microchip registration yearly and maintaining the same phone number just in case. What she couldn't have known was that Tom had wandered nearly 20 miles, eventually being taken in by Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman who lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Boston. Margaret, believing Tom to be a stray, had taken him to a different vet who, inexplicably, failed to check for a microchip. She gave him a new name tag but kept his old collar, charmed by its weathered elegance. For the next 6 years, Tom lived a second life as Margaret's companion, bringing joy to her final years while never forgetting his first home. With hands shaking from excitement and nervousness, Scott dialed the number on the tag. After 3 rings, a warm, British-accented voice answered. "Hello? Is this Susan White?" "Yes, who's calling?" Scott took a deep breath. "My name is Dr. Scott Smith from Riverside Animal Shelter. I'm calling about your cat, the one you lost 6 years ago." There was a long pause, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "You found Tom? After all this time? Oh my God. Is he alive?" "Yes, Mrs. White, he's alive and physically healthy, though he's been through quite an ordeal. Would you be able to come to the shelter?" Susan's voice cracked. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. The next half hour was the longest of Scott's career. He spent it with Tom, explaining in soft tones what was about to happen, though he wasn't sure how much the cat understood. Tom seemed more alert than he had been in days, his ears pricked forward, tail twitching with nervous energy. When Susan White walked through the shelter doors, Scott knew immediately this was no ordinary reunion. She was a tall, elegant woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes that had seen their share of sorrow. The moment she entered the examination room where Tom was waiting, the air seemed to change. Tom, who had been sitting on the examination table, went completely still. His eyes, fixed on Susan, grew wide with recognition. For a moment, no one moved or breathed. Then, with a cry that was half meow and half sob, Tom launched himself across the room into Susan's arms. "Oh, my darling boy," Susan whispered, tears streaming down her face as she held him close. "I never stopped looking for you. Not for one single day." The reunion might have been perfect, if not for what happened next. As Scott was preparing the paperwork to release Tom back to Susan, the door opened again. Sarah Martinez stood there with another woman. Younger, perhaps in her 40s, with worry lines creasing her forehead. "Dr. Smith," Sarah said softly, "this is Olivia Thompson, Mrs. Thompson's daughter. She's just returned from overseas and, well, she'd like to see Tom." The room grew quiet enough to hear the soft purr rumbling from Tom's throat as he remained cradled in Susan's arms. Olivia Thompson stepped forward, her eyes filling with tears as she saw the cat. "I know I haven't been around much," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I was stationed in Germany with the Air Force, could only visit Mom a few times a year. But Tom, he was everything to her. He gave her a reason to keep going after Dad died. The nurses said he never left her side in the hospital, right up until..." She broke off, wiping her eyes. "I was hoping to adopt him, to keep that last piece of her with me. I'm out of the service now, settling back here in Boston." The silence that followed was heavy with competing claims of love and loss. Susan's arms tightened protectively around Tom, who had begun to look between the two women with an almost human expression of concern. It was Scott who finally spoke. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "there's a way to honor both bonds here." And so began an arrangement that would prove to be as healing as it was unconventional. Susan and Olivia, despite their different backgrounds and initial reluctance, found common ground in their love for Tom and their understanding of grief. They lived only a few miles apart, and over coffee one afternoon, worked out a shared custody agreement that would have seemed absurd for any other cat. But Tom was not any other cat. He would spend weekdays with Susan, helping her with her editing work just as he had before, his practiced paw tapping the screen when he spotted errors. On weekends, he would stay with Olivia, curling up beside her as she shared stories about her mother, both of them finding comfort in memories of the woman they'd lost. The arrangement brought unexpected gifts. Susan and Olivia began meeting regularly to exchange not just Tom, but stories and friendship. Olivia found in Susan a mentor who helped her navigate civilian life and grief, while Susan discovered in Olivia the daughter she'd never had. Tom, far from being confused by the arrangement, seemed to understand his role in healing both women's hearts. One year after the remarkable reunion, Scott received an invitation to Sunday dinner at Olivia's house. He arrived to find both women in the kitchen, preparing a meal together while Tom supervised from his perch on the counter. The scene was so far from the sorrow of that November morning that it almost seemed like a dream. "You know," Olivia said as they sat down to eat, "Mom used to say that Tom had a secret. We thought it was just the medication talking, but now I wonder. Maybe she somehow knew he had another family out there, another love waiting to be reclaimed." Susan reached over to scratch Tom's ears as he settled between their chairs. "I prefer to think he had enough love for both our families. Sometimes the heart expands to hold more than we think possible." Scott watched as Tom purred contentedly, moving from one woman to the other, accepting their affection with equal joy. In his 20 years as a veterinarian, he'd seen countless examples of the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals, but none quite like this. The cat who had arrived at his shelter grieving and lost had become a bridge between strangers, transforming their sorrow into an unexpected family. Tom's collar tag, which had seemed such a mystery, had led them all to a truth about love, that it doesn't diminish when shared, but multiplies, creating connections that defy explanation. As the evening drew to a close, Scott found himself in the garden with Susan, watching through the window as Olivia played with Tom in the living room. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the same hint of winter it had that day at the shelter, but now it felt full of promise rather than melancholy. "You know," Susan said quietly, "I used to think losing Tom was the worst thing that could happen to me. After my husband died, Tom was my whole world. When he disappeared, it felt like losing everything all over again." She paused, watching as Tom performed an acrobatic leap after a toy mouse. "But now I think perhaps he needed to be lost so he could be found in exactly the right way, at exactly the right time, bringing together people who needed each other just as much as they needed him." Scott nodded, understanding completely. In his profession, he'd learned that animals often seem to possess a wisdom beyond human comprehension. They appeared in people's lives at precisely the moment they were needed most, offering comfort, joy, and sometimes, as in Tom's case, the power to heal multiple hearts at once. Inside, Tom had finished his game and was now sitting in the window, looking out at them with those wise amber eyes that had first captured Scott's attention. He was no longer the grieving cat who had arrived at the shelter, nor was he exactly the same cat who had lived with either Susan or Margaret. He had become something more, a testament to the endurance of love and the unexpected ways life finds to mend what's broken. As Scott drove home that night, He thought about the message engraved on Tom's collar tag. He is deeply missed. Those words, written in a time of loss, had transformed into a bridge between past and present, between grief and joy, between strangers who became family. They reminded him that sometimes the deepest wounds can lead to the most profound healing, if only we're brave enough to follow where love leads. The next morning, as Scott prepared for another day at the shelter, he found himself looking forward to the unexpected stories yet to unfold. Every animal that came through his doors carried their own tale, their own potential for creating connections and healing hearts. And while not every story would be as remarkable as Tom's, each one held the possibility of transforming loss into love, sorrow into joy, and strangers into family. After all, in a world that often seemed too full of endings, Tom had proved that sometimes what appears to be an ending is really just the beginning of a different kind of love story, one that expands the heart's capacity for joy in ways we never imagined possible.